It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the police arrived at Jenna's apartment, the kind of day where the sun shone just right, casting long shadows over the sidewalk as the world moved forward in its usual quiet rhythm. Jenna, a 27-year-old nurse living in a small, close-knit community, was just waking up, getting ready for her shift at the hospital. Little did she know, her life was about to be turned upside down in ways she never could have imagined. Jenna had always been a good person, kind, compassionate, always willing to help others. That's what made what was about to happen even harder to believe. She had no criminal record, never even a speeding ticket, but suddenly, in a twist that no one saw coming, she found herself being accused of something she didn't do. It started with a simple call, a report of a robbery at a local jewelry store down the road from Jenna's apartment. A young woman, black and in her late 20s, had been seen running from the store, and the store clerk had identified the woman as the perpetrator. The description wasn't exact, but somehow, it was enough for the police to take action. Jenna's morning was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. When she opened it, 2 officers stood there, their expressions serious, their hands resting on their holsters. "Mrs. Thomas, we need to speak with you," one of them said, his voice low but firm. She was confused at first, thinking it must be some kind of mistake. Maybe they had the wrong apartment, or perhaps someone was trying to play a prank on her. But as they explained that she was a suspect in a robbery, her heart dropped. "Are you serious?" Jenna asked, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "I'm a nurse. I have a job at the hospital. I don't even know anything about this." The officers didn't respond to her protest. Instead, they insisted that she come with them to the station for questioning. Jenna was scared, but she had nothing to hide. After all, she had never been involved in anything illegal, never even been in trouble with the law. The thought of being dragged into a police station for a crime she hadn't committed seemed impossible. But it was happening. As Jenna sat in the interrogation room, the weight of the situation began to sink in. She could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken assumption that she had done something wrong. The questions came fast, one after another. "Where were you yesterday at 4 p.m.? Do you have an alibi? Why were you seen near the jewelry store?" Jenna answered truthfully, explaining she had been working at the hospital all day, with no time to commit any crime, let alone a robbery. But the more she spoke, the more skeptical the officers seemed to get. They had nothing but the description of the woman from the store, and yet they were convinced she was involved. It wasn't long before Jenna realized that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. There was something more to it, a hidden bias, a judgment she couldn't quite put her finger on, but could feel deep in her bones. The tension in the room grew thicker, and Jenna's frustration mounted. How could they not see that this was all a mistake? The next few hours were a blur. Jenna's name was broadcast over the local news, and soon social media exploded with rumors and accusations. As the story gained traction, people were quick to form opinions. Some were sympathetic, others downright cruel. The hashtags Jenna Thomas and wrongfully accused began to trend, and Jenna's life was suddenly no longer her own. Her phone rang constantly, friends, family, even strangers calling to ask if she was okay, offering support or, in some cases, adding to the gossip. Jenna felt trapped, suffocated by the chaos surrounding her. And as the police continued to question her, the pressure mounted, making it harder to maintain her composure. Then, just when Jenna thought it couldn't get any worse, something shocking happened. A key piece of evidence came to light: a security camera from a nearby store, showing a figure leaving the jewelry store at the exact time of the robbery. But when the footage was analyzed, the face of the suspect wasn't Jenna's. In fact, it wasn't even a woman, it was a man. Jenna's heart leapt with hope. Could this mean she was finally going to be exonerated? Had the real culprit finally been caught? But just as the police were about to release her, another twist in the story emerged, one that would send shockwaves through the community. The footage from the nearby store wasn't as clear as they'd hoped. The suspect was wearing a hood, and the image was grainy. The police were back to square one. They were still convinced Jenna had something to do with the robbery, even though the evidence pointed elsewhere. The confusion and doubt were eating away at her. Jenna had no idea who could be behind this, or why she had been targeted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. Why was the community so quick to point the finger at her? Was this all just a case of racial profiling, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? As Jenna sat in her apartment, the weight of the situation settled in. Her name had been dragged through the mud, and despite all her efforts to clear her name, the accusations kept coming. The walls seemed to close in on her as she struggled to make sense of the bizarre turn her life had taken. But the story doesn't end there. As Jenna prepared for her day in court, the last thing she expected was a phone call, a mysterious tip-off from an anonymous source that claimed to have information about the real thief. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost scared, but it was clear there was something Jenna didn't know. Something big. What was the truth behind the robbery? And who was really behind the accusations against Jenna? All Jenna wanted was to return to her normal life, but now she was left with more questions than answers. She had been falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit, and now, with new leads coming to light, she had to decide whether to take the risk and pursue the truth or protect herself from further harm. The story is just beginning, and what comes next could change everything. Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking secrets that led to Jenna's wrongful accusation and the unexpected twist that no one saw coming. Jenna couldn't sleep. The weight of everything was too much, her mind spinning with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flashing lights of the police car, the disappointed faces of the people she knew, and the endless stream of accusations and rumors online. The flood of social media posts that flooded her feeds only seemed to heighten her sense of dread. Some people believed her, others were quick to condemn her, hurling insults and casting doubt on her character. It had been 3 days since the police had shown up at her door. 3 days since her life had been torn apart by something so utterly incomprehensible. How had it come to this? The phone call she received yesterday afternoon, the one from the anonymous tipster, had only added to the confusion. The voice on the other end had been shaky, low, almost paranoid. It was as though the person had been scared to even say what they knew. They claimed they had information that could clear her name, but when Jenna tried to press for more details, the person had quickly hung up, leaving her with nothing but a dead phone line and 1,000 questions. Who had made the call? Was it someone who knew something, or just another prankster trying to stir up trouble? Jenna had tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail each time. No trace. No leads. But it was the second part of conversation that had left her feeling even more unnerved. You need to be careful. The truth isn't what you think it is. Someone's watching you. Jenna couldn't shake those words from her mind, especially now. She had no idea who would want to hurt her, and if she was being watched, she didn't know how long it had been happening. It felt as if the walls were closing in, each step forward only taking her deeper into an abyss of uncertainty. Her days were filled with police interrogations and endless phone calls from friends and family members. The news stations were still buzzing with the story, and Jenna's name was plastered all over social media. Most of it was vile. People who didn't know her, who had never met her, were calling her names and demanding answers that she couldn't give. She was being tried in the court of public opinion, and the judgment was swift and unforgiving. The fact that she was black, living in a predominantly white neighborhood, only seemed to heighten the anger and accusations. Jenna had always believed she lived in a safe place. Her neighbors were kind, and she felt like part of the community. But now, the same people who once waved to her on the street, avoided eye contact, or worse, looked at her with suspicion. The woman they once knew as the quiet, caring nurse, who'd lived in the building for years, had been replaced by a figure of doubt and fear. She couldn't escape it. The accusations were everywhere. It was late one evening when Jenna's phone buzzed again. She checked the screen, half expecting it to be another call from the police. Or, worse, another hateful comment from someone online. But this time, it was a text message from her sister LaShonda. "Jenna, I know things are bad right now, but you need to come home. Mom is worried. She wants to see you." Jenna stared at the message for a long time. She hadn't been home in weeks. The thought of seeing her mother, who had always been a pillar of strength, now seemed too overwhelming. Her mother had always been there for her, but now, with all the chaos surrounding Jenna, she feared she would only bring more trouble to her family. She couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her mother's eyes. But there was something in LaShonda's text that tugged at her, a quiet desperation that made her feel as if she needed to take a step back from everything, even if just for a little while. She needed to regain some sense of normalcy, even if it was just for a few hours. Jenna packed a small bag and left her apartment, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. Her hands trembled as she reached for the keys. The air outside felt thick, the shadows of the trees lining the street, casting long, dark silhouettes across the sidewalk. Jenna had never felt so small, so vulnerable. But she had no choice. She had to leave the chaos behind, if only for a short time. The drive to her mother's house was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional whir of the tires against the pavement. Jenna didn't have much to say, and her mind remained clouded with worry. When she finally arrived, she was greeted by her mother's warm embrace. "You need to let this go, baby," her mother said softly, stroking her hair. "You're not the one who did this, and you will get through it." But Jenna didn't believe that anymore. The more time she spent thinking about the situation, the more questions emerged. Why had she been targeted? Who was behind the false accusations? And what about the strange phone call, the one that had come from nowhere, warning her that the truth wasn't what she thought it was? There was so much more to this story, and Jenna knew it. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Jenna couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something she wasn't seeing, something lurking just beyond her grasp. The conversation around the table was light, but Jenna's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't focus on the laughter or the casual talk. It was as if a dark cloud hung over her, waiting to unleash a storm. After dinner, Jenna retired to the small guest room that her mother had prepared for her. She sat by the window, staring out into the night. Her phone sat on the bed beside her, silent for the first time in days. She didn't want to answer any more calls or texts. She just needed time to think. The night stretched on, the hours slipping by as Jenna tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Eventually, she gave in and reached for her phone. As her thumb hovered over the screen, she noticed a missed call. It was from a number she didn't recognize. Without thinking, she hit the redial button. The line rang once, twice, before someone picked up. "Jenna Thomas?" A voice asked, sharp and quick. "Yes," she replied, her heart pounding. "Who is this?" The person on the other end paused for a moment before speaking again. "I know what really happened. And I know you didn't do it." Jenna's breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. There was a long silence, and then the voice spoke again, its tone lower, more urgent this time. "Meet me tomorrow at the old warehouse on the east side of town. I'll explain everything, but you need to come alone." Before Jenna could respond, the line went dead. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, oppressive. Jenna's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea who this person was, but they were claiming to know the truth about the robbery. Could this be the break she'd been waiting for, or was it another trap, designed to pull her deeper into the nightmare? She stared at her phone for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was this her chance to finally uncover the truth? Or was it a mistake to trust someone who had remained anonymous until now? The hours passed slowly, as Jenna debated whether or not to go. She knew this could be her only opportunity to clear her name, but she was also terrified. What if this was a trap? What if the person on the other end was trying to lure her into a dangerous situation? And yet, deep down, Jenna knew she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't sit idly by while her life fell apart. She had to take a risk. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind still racing with questions, her body tense with anticipation. Tonight, the mystery would only deepen, but Jenna was determined to find the answers, no matter what it took. The truth was waiting for her on the other side. Jenna stepped out of her mother's house, the night air sharp against her skin. It felt like the world had gone silent, as if the heavy weight of her situation had sucked all the sound out of the air. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only noise was the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional chirp of crickets in the dark. Her mind raced. She still didn't know who had called her or why they wanted to meet at the old warehouse. Every instinct in her screamed to stay away, to avoid being pulled further into the chaos. But this could be the only chance she had to clear her name. The drive to the warehouse took longer than Jenna expected. It was on outskirts of town, near industrial section, where abandoned buildings loomed in the shadows like forgotten ghosts. The warehouse itself was dilapidated, its broken windows and rusted doors, giving it a menacing look in dim light. Jenna pulled up across the street, her heart hammering as she scanned area for any signs of movement. She couldn't shake feeling that she was being watched. After what felt like an eternity, she stepped out of car and walked toward entrance, every step echoing in stillness. The weight of her decision was sinking in, but she knew there was no turning back now. She had to find out who was behind the accusations. As Jenna approached the door, a sudden gust of wind rattled the old metal, sending a shiver down her spine. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one else was nearby. The street was empty, save for a few stray cats rummaging through the trash cans in the distance. She pushed the door open cautiously and stepped inside. The inside of the warehouse was dark, with only a faint flicker of light coming from a broken window above. The air inside was musty and thick, carrying the smell of damp wood and rusted metal. As her eyes adjusted to the low light, Jenna made out the shadowy figure standing near the far end of the room. The figure was hooded, their face obscured in the darkness. "Jenna Thomas?" the figure asked, their voice low and gravelly. "I'm glad you came." Jenna's pulse quickened. She could barely make out the figure's features, but the tone of the voice felt strangely familiar. It wasn't the same voice from the phone call, but something about it made her uneasy. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. The figure stepped into the faint light, and Jenna gasped. It was a man young, maybe in his early 30s. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes dark and calculating. But what struck her most was the look in his eyes, an unsettling combination of fear and determination. "I'm the one who called you," he said, taking a step closer. "And I know who really did it." Jenna's mind spun. The man was the one behind the cryptic message. Was he truly on her side, or was this all part of some twisted game? "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice more insistent this time. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's not important right now," he said, his voice low. "What matters is the truth. And if you want to know who's really behind the robbery and why you've been framed, you need to listen to me." Jenna felt a surge of both anger and desperation. "I've heard enough of this," she snapped. "I'm not here to play games. I just want to know what's going on. Why was I targeted? Why is everyone accusing me of something I didn't do?" The man exhaled sharply, his face hardening. "You're not the only one being set up, Jenna. Someone wants you to be the scapegoat for something much bigger. But the truth is, there's more to this than just a simple robbery." Jenna felt a chill run through her veins. This was getting worse by the second. What are you talking about? Who's behind this? And why me? The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. It's not just about the robbery, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. There's a conspiracy, Jenna. A much larger plan, and you're part of it. Jenna's heart dropped. What are you saying? A conspiracy? What does this have to do with me? The man took a deep breath, his expression softening for the first time. You've been framed, yes, but it wasn't random. Someone knew you were vulnerable, someone with power, someone who could manipulate the situation and use it to their advantage. Jenna's mind raced. You need to make sense, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Who could have done this? And why? The man looked over his shoulder, as if making sure they were alone. He stepped closer to Jenna, lowering his voice even further. It's connected to the hospital where you work, he said, his words sinking in like cold water. There's something happening behind the scenes. A network of people who are using your name to cover up their tracks. And the robbery? That was just the beginning. Jenna blinked, her head spinning with disbelief. What? My job? What are you talking about? I don't understand any of this. The man swallowed hard, clearly torn between saying too much and not enough. There's a lot more at play here than you know. You were targeted because you're close to something that's bigger than you or me. They needed a distraction, and you were the perfect target. Jenna's legs wobbled, and she staggered back, pressing a hand to the wall for support. I don't know what you're talking about. This makes no sense. The man stepped forward again, his voice urgent. You're in danger, Jenna. If you don't stop asking questions, if you don't stay quiet, they'll come for you next. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. The man's warning hit her like a slap in the face. She'd been trying to understand why she was being framed, but this was something entirely different. Was there really a conspiracy tied to the hospital she worked for? Could there be a connection between the robbery and her job? I don't understand, she whispered, her mind racing with confusion and fear. Who are they? Who's behind this? The man looked over his shoulder again, clearly growing more agitated. You need to get out of here, he said, his voice rising. Now? Jenna took a step back, her heart pounding. She could feel the tension in the air, the danger closing in on her from every angle. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't let go of the feeling that she was on the verge of something much bigger. She had to know the truth. Suddenly, the warehouse door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The man's eyes widened in shock. They're here, he whispered, panic flashing across his face. You need to leave. Now. Jenna's blood ran cold. She turned to look at the new arrival, her heart skipping a beat. The figure that entered the warehouse wasn't just anyone. It was one of the police officers who'd been questioning her the day she was accused. Jenna, we need to talk, the officer said, his voice cold and professional. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something Jenna couldn't quite place. Before she could react, the man who had been talking to her grabbed her arm. Run, he shouted, pushing her toward the back of the warehouse. Jenna barely had time to process what was happening. She felt the officer's gaze follow her as she sprinted toward the rear exit of the building. The air was thick with tension, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. Her mind was spinning, the mystery of the robbery, the conspiracy, and the strange man who had come to warn her all tangled together in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. But as she ran, one thing became crystal clear. This was far from over. The game was just beginning. Jenna ran, her legs pumping beneath her as the dim light of the warehouse blurred around her. Her heart hammered in her chest, each breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear footsteps behind her, loud, hurried, and then, through the haze of panic, she heard a voice shout her name. It wasn't the officers. It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned her about the conspiracy. His voice was desperate. "Jenna, stop. They'll catch up if you don't." But Jenna couldn't stop. She didn't know who to trust anymore. The officer, the man, the cryptic phone calls, they were all tangled together in a web of lies and deceit, and it was becoming impossible to separate truth from illusion. She sprinted toward the back door of the warehouse, her mind racing. Suddenly, she burst through the exit and found herself in a dark alleyway. She skidded to a halt, looking for a place to hide. There were no cars in sight, no safe haven to run to. The cold air cut through her, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. But before she could take another step, the officer was there, his face grim, his gun drawn. "Don't move, Jenna," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're under arrest for the robbery." Jenna's breath hitched. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had just escaped the warehouse, and now here he was, standing in front of her like she was the criminal. "What are you talking about?" She gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. "I didn't do it." "You know I didn't." The officer's eyes narrowed, but there was something unreadable in his gaze, something she hadn't seen before. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of doubt. "It's not what it seems, Jenna," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You need to come with me." Jenna took a step back, her hand trembling as it hovered over her phone. She had to find a way out fast. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice barely a whisper, pleading. "I didn't rob that store. You have to believe me." And then, from behind her, she heard the voice of the man she had left behind in the warehouse. "She's telling the truth." Jenna whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The man was standing there, breathing hard but determined. He was the one who had warned her, the one who had told her to run, and now he was here, trying to help her. The officer's eyes darted between them, his expression hardening. "I said, don't move." The man took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "She's innocent, officer. You need to hear me out." Jenna could hardly keep up with the exchange. "Who are you?" she demanded, her eyes flashing with anger and confusion. "Why are you helping me?" The man's face twisted with frustration, but he didn't back down. "Because I know who really did it," he said, his voice tense. "And I know why you were set up." Jenna's stomach churned. "What are you talking about? What do you know?" The man took a deep breath, his eyes finally locking with hers. "I'm the one who orchestrated the whole thing," he said, his words like a punch to the gut. Jenna staggered back, her mind spinning in disbelief. "What? You did this? Why?" The man lowered his gaze, clearly filled with regret. "Because I had no choice," he murmured. "I was being blackmailed. They made me do it, Jenna." Jenna shook her head in disbelief. Who made you do this?" The man hesitated, his face grim. "It's not just one person. It's an entire group, people from within the hospital. There's a deeper conspiracy, Jenna. They knew you would be an easy target. They knew you were vulnerable because of the way people perceived you, and they used that to their advantage. You've been framed for something much bigger." Jenna's blood ran cold. Her thoughts raced. Was it possible? Could the people she worked with, the ones she trusted every day, really be involved in something so sinister? She had always believed in the goodness of her colleagues, in the integrity of the healthcare system. But now, everything was being shattered before her eyes. The officer looked back and forth between Jenna and the man, clearly confused by the revelations. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low but trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to Jenna, his voice urgent. "I'm sorry, Jenna. I didn't mean for this to happen. But they promised me they'd hurt my family if I didn't go along with it. I was trying to protect them, but in the end, I made things worse." Jenna's mind reeled with anger, disbelief, and fear. How could someone do this to her? How could they manipulate her, use her like a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was part of. Who's behind this? Who's controlling all of this? Jenna demanded, her voice shaking with fury. The man swallowed hard and looked over at the officer, his face dark with guilt. It's someone you know, Jenna. It's your supervisor, Dr. Collins. He's the one running everything. He's been using the hospital's resources to launder money, and he's tied up in something much bigger. When I tried to expose him, he threatened to ruin me, so I did what he asked. Jenna's eyes widened in shock. Dr. Collins? The man who had always been kind to her. The one who had helped her when she needed it most. It seemed impossible, yet everything the man said lined up with the pieces Jenna had been trying to make sense of. The officer looked at the man in disbelief. Are you saying Dr. Collins is involved in this? The man nodded. He's been using people like me to cover up his tracks. He's running a scheme that goes all the way back to the board of the hospital. And now, Jenna, you're the one who's paying for it. Jenna felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She was standing in the middle of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her heart pounded in her ears as she pieced together the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a robbery. This was an orchestrated attack designed to silence her and cover up a web of corruption that reached far deeper than she had ever imagined. She turned back to the officer. You have to believe me, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Dr. Collins is behind all of this. He framed me. You need to arrest him. The officer's expression hardened, but there was doubt in his eyes. And how do you expect me to prove any of this? Jenna glanced at the man who had helped her, her heart still racing. I don't know yet, she said, but I know we can find the evidence. I know there's something more to this. Just as she spoke, a dark figure stepped out of the shadows, and Jenna froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was Dr. Collins. He stood there, his expression cold and calculating, as if everything had gone according to plan. Well, well, he said with a sneer. It seems like the cat's out of the bag. Jenna's heart sank. You were behind all of this. Dr. Collins smiled. It's always been about control, Jenna. You were just an obstacle. A pawn in a much bigger game. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The strange behavior at work, the sudden accusations, the way the system had turned against her so quickly, it had all been orchestrated by someone with far more power than Jenna had ever imagined. And now, standing before her, was the man responsible for it all. But just as she prepared to confront him, a shocking realization hit her. Dr. Collins wasn't alone. Standing beside him, a familiar face stepped forward. It was her mother. Jenna's knees nearly gave out as she looked at her mother, standing there with an expression of calm indifference. Mom? Jenna's voice cracked as she stumbled backward. You were part of this. Her mother gave her a faint, almost regretful smile. I didn't want to hurt you, Jenna. But there's more at stake than you understand. Dr. Collins is offering us a way out, a way to finally be free of the life we've been stuck in. Jenna's mind raced as the world around her collapsed. She had been betrayed by everyone, by the man who she thought was helping her, by the officer who had been sworn to protect her, and most painfully, by the one person she had always trusted, her own mother. Her heart broke as the truth settled in. The web of lies had only just begun to unravel. Jenna stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Her mother's presence, standing side by side with Dr. Collins, was like a punch to gut she didn't know she was prepared for. Everything she thought she knew had been upended in a moment. Her mother, her rock, the woman who had raised her and been there for every important moment in her life, was now standing with the very man who had been orchestrating her downfall. The betrayal hit harder than anything Jenna had experienced before. Mom, how could you? Jenna managed to choke out, her voice shaking with a mix of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Her mother didn't flinch. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and understanding, were now cold and distant, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. "Jenna, you don't understand," her mother said, her tone almost regretful, but there was no emotion behind it. "There's a bigger picture here. I didn't want to hurt you, but this was the only way." Jenna's hands trembled, her fists clenching at her sides. "The only way? You've been part of this all along?" Her voice was rising, her disbelief growing. "How could you betray me like this?" Her mother's gaze shifted between her and Dr. Collins before she spoke again. "I did what I had to do to protect us. To protect you." There was a flicker of hesitation in her voice, but it was quickly masked by a sharpness Jenna hadn't heard before. "You've always been too innocent, too naive to see how the world really works. The truth is, Jenna, we've been living on borrowed time." Jenna's mind reeled. It felt like the room was closing in around her, the walls too tight, the air too heavy. She glanced back at the officer, whose face was still twisted in disbelief. Was he in on this too? Was he somehow part of the conspiracy? The thought was almost too much to bear. But before she could say anything more, Dr. Collins stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's done, Jenna," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You've been used, and your part in all of this is over." Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back. Her mother wasn't backing down. Neither was Dr. Collins. But now, more than ever, Jenna knew that she couldn't let them win. Not when the truth was so close to breaking free. She had to find a way to expose them, to get the truth out there for everyone to see. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Her mind flashed to the many hours she had spent in the hospital, the conversations she'd had with her colleagues, the strange way things had begun to unravel at work. She had no idea who could be reaching out now, but something told her that this was no ordinary text. It was a message from her best friend Maya. "Jenna, I know what's going on. I've been trying to get this to you for hours. Check the email." Jenna's pulse quickened. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and opened her inbox. There was an email from Maya. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." Jenna quickly opened the email, her hands shaking with anticipation. She scrolled through the message. Maya had sent screenshots of several suspicious financial transactions linked to the hospital's accounts, many of which were tied to Dr. Collins. The transactions led to a web of offshore accounts and shady businesses, all linked to the people who had framed Jenna for the robbery. Her mother's name was listed on the final page. Jenna's heart sank. She felt the weight of the world press down on her shoulders as she turned to face her mother. "You were part of this the entire time," she said, her voice breaking. "You were helping him, Dr. Collins, and now you're caught." Her mother's expression softened just a little, as if the weight of guilt was starting to settle in. "Jenna, you don't know what it's like, being stuck in this world," her mother whispered. "We did what we had to do to survive." Jenna's anger surged. "Survive?" she repeated, her voice shaking with fury. "You thought you were protecting me by throwing me into the lion's den? I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask for any of this." Dr. Collins stepped forward, his face cold and hard. "It's over, Jenna. You can't escape this. The harder you fight, the more trouble you'll bring upon yourself. You've already lost. You're done." But Jenna wasn't done. She wasn't going to be silenced or forced into submission. Her mind was racing, her instincts screaming at her to keep fighting. She wasn't going to let her mother or Dr. Collins win. Before she could make another move, the officer stepped forward, his expression now resolute. "I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not going to let this go any further," he said, his voice strong. "You've all crossed the line." Jenna's eyes widened. Could it be? Could the officer really be on her side? Dr. Collins's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're getting into, officer," he warned. "This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." The officer didn't flinch. "I've already seen enough," he said. "I've been doing some digging of my own, and it looks like Jenna's not the only one who's been set up." Jenna's heart leapt. Could the officer have finally figured out the truth? Was this the moment when everything would finally come to light? "I have evidence," the officer said, pulling out a folder from his jacket. "Evidence that ties Dr. Collins and your mother to the entire conspiracy." Jenna's mother's eyes flickered with panic. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she shouted, her calm demeanor shattering. "You can't bring them down. You don't know who's behind all of this." Dr. Collins stepped in front of her, his face tight with anger. "It's over, Jenna," he growled. "You'll regret this." But Jenna wasn't scared anymore. She had the truth on her side, and now, with the officer's help, she could finally take down the people who had tried to ruin her life. "Your secrets are out," Jenna said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "And now the world will know who you really are." As the officer started to make the arrest, Jenna felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The truth was finally coming to light, but the cost had been higher than she ever imagined. Her mother, the woman who had raised her, was now on the verge of being implicated in a vast conspiracy. And the man who had once been her ally, her rock, was the mastermind behind it all. The scene outside the warehouse was chaotic. Police cars, sirens blaring, pulled up one by one, lights flashing as the officers moved in to arrest Dr. Collins and her mother. Jenna watched in disbelief, her heart still heavy, as everything she had once known was torn apart. Her mother's face was pale, her shoulders slumped with the weight of guilt and fear. But Jenna knew she had no choice but to move forward. This was the only way for her to truly be free. As they loaded Dr. Collins into the back of a squad car, Jenna caught her mother's gaze one last time. Her mother's eyes were filled with unspeakable pain, and for a moment, Jenna almost felt a pang of sympathy. But she quickly shook it off. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past anymore. She had to look ahead, toward a future that was free of secrets and lies. As the officers led her mother away, Jenna felt a quiet resolution settle over her. She had been through hell and back, but she had survived. And now, she could finally begin to rebuild her life, to reclaim the pieces of herself that had been stolen. And though it was hard, she knew she could do it. She had to. As Jenna walked away from the chaos, the weight of the last few days heavy on her shoulders, she took a deep breath, allowing herself to fully take in the truth. The world had turned upside down, but she had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever came next. In the end, the truth had prevailed, but it had come at a price. And Jenna knew she would never forget the lessons she had learned, the harsh, painful reality that sometimes the people we love are the ones who betray us most. She was free now, but the scars would remain. And as the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow over the city, Jenna couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning.